Did you know the famous white beaches of the Florida Panhandle are actually the ground-up remains of the Appalachian Mountains? Or that there's an island off this coast where 500-pound Asian elk roam wild? Animals that have no business being in North America at all? How about the fact that one small bay here once produced 90% of Florida's oysters? And then, almost overnight, the entire thing collapsed and shut down. Well, there's a lot more to the Florida Panhandle than spring break and sugar sand. Look a little closer and you'll find ancient trees older than the dinosaurs, caves nobody thinks Florida has, and a swamp so brutal a dying man named it after hell. And today we're breaking down 20 facts about the Panhandle that even lifelong Floridians have never heard. Let's get into it. Fact 20. The beaches that used to be mountains. Everyone assumes that the famous white sand is crushed coral or seashells. It is not. The sugar white beaches of the Panhandle are made of almost pure quartz, close to 99%, and every grain was carried down from the Appalachian Mountains by the Apalachicola River over thousands of years. When the last ice age ended and the glaciers melted around 20,000 years ago, that meltwater ground the quartz into a fine, soft powder and delivered it to the Gulf. When you walk on Pensacola Beach, you are walking on the eroded bones of a mountain range hundreds of miles away. Fact 19. The sand that squeaks and stays cool. Here's the part beachgoers notice but never understand. The quartz in this sand is so pure and so finely rounded that it actually squeaks under your feet as you walk, a high-pitched chirp coming from the grains rubbing together. Because quartz reflects heat instead of soaking it up, the sand stays cool enough to walk barefoot at midday in August, something most beaches in the world cannot claim. The whitest of it stretches from around Pensacola east toward Cape San Blas, a beach that sounds like it's talking back and refuses to burn your feet, and almost nobody asks why. Fact 18. The reason the sand stops at an invisible line. The white sand doesn't fade out gradually. It ends. Travel west past Pensacola Pass toward Alabama, and the pure quartz beaches give way to darker, coarser sand, almost like crossing a border. The reason sits hundreds of miles away in the Mississippi River, which dumps its heavy load of mud and sediment out into the Gulf and then sweeps it westward, away from Florida. With no major rivers carrying sediment into the northeastern Gulf, the Panhandle water stays clear and the sand stays white. An invisible line in the sand, drawn by a river most Floridians never think about. Fact 17. The island full of animals that don't belong. Off the coast near Apalachicola sits a barrier island with a secret that sounds invented. St. Vincent Island is home to a herd of sambar deer, a species of elk native to Southeast Asia, with adults weighing between 500 and 600 pounds and standing up to 6 feet tall. They were brought in during the early 1900s when the island was a private hunting preserve. And unlike the zebras and antelope that were later removed, the sambar stayed. These animals are strong enough to swim through the sea between islands. A piece of the Asian wilderness has been quietly living off the Florida coast for over a century. Fact 16. The 12,000-acre refuge you can only reach by boat. That same island holds one of the wildest protected places in the state. St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge covers roughly 12,490 acres of dunes, marshes, and freshwater lakes. And there is no bridge, no visitor center, no drinking water, and no restrooms. The only way in is by boat. It was bought in 1968 using duck stamp conservation dollars, and it shelters loggerhead turtles, bald eagles, and endangered red wolves. Its beach ridges record 3,000 years of the island slowly building outward. A wilderness the size of a small city sits offshore, and most people on the mainland have never set foot on it. Fact 15. The swamp a dying man named after hell. Between the Apalachicola and Ochlockonee rivers sprawls a place with one of the darkest names in America. Tate's Hell State Forest covers roughly 202,000 acres of coastal swamp, and the name comes from a real event. In 1875, a local farmer named C.B. Tate went into the swamp with his dogs chasing a panther, got hopelessly lost, and wandered for days, according to legend as long as 7 days and nights. When he finally staggered out near Carabel, he lived just long enough to say his name and that he had come from hell before collapsing. People still hunt and paddle there today in a swamp named by its own victim. Fact 14. The forest of ancient dwarf trees. Deep inside that swamp grows something botanists travel across the state to see. A stand of dwarf bald cypress trees, some of them centuries old, yet standing less than 15 feet tall, permanently stunted by the harsh, waterlogged, nutrient-starved ground. A boardwalk lets you look out over the tops of trees that were alive for generations and never grew past the height of a room. These miniature ancient trees do not grow anywhere in the ordinary way you would expect a cypress to grow. Time barely touched them, and hardly anyone knows they exist. Fact 13. The only place in Florida you can walk into a cave. Ask anyone and they'll tell you Florida is too flat and too wet to have caves. Near Mariana, that assumption falls apart. Florida Caverns State Park is the only state park in Florida that offers guided tours through dry, air-filled limestone caves, full of stalactites, stalagmites, flowstones, and delicate straws. The rock itself began forming around 38 million years ago from ancient sea sediments, which is why guides can point out fossil shark teeth embedded in the ceiling. The Civilian Conservation Corps carved the trails through it during the Great Depression, and it opened in 1942. An entire underground world exists in a state everyone swears is too soggy to have one. Fact 12. The tree that time forgot. Along the bluffs of the Apalachicola River grows one of the rarest and oldest tree species on Earth. The Florida torreya is a conifer that scientists say once grew across North America, but today survives in the wild only along a narrow stretch of these river bluffs. It is considered a relic of the last ice age, a survivor stranded here when the glaciers retreated. Early settlers called it the stinking cedar because of the strong smell it gave off when cut. A living fossil clings to a few Florida ravines, and almost no one driving past has any idea it is there. Fact 11. The tree that's almost gone. Here's where that story turns grim. In the early 1800s, an estimated 600,000 torreya trees grew in the Apalachicola River Valley. Today, only around 200 survive in the wild. The species crashed over the past 60 years, hit by fungal disease, changing conditions, and altered fire patterns until barely a fraction of 1% remained. The famous biologist E.O. Wilson, who first visited these bluffs in 1957, later planted a seedling here as part of the fight to save it. To keep the species alive at all, botanists have moved the largest surviving population into gardens hundreds of miles north in Georgia. One of Earth's oldest trees is being kept alive on life support right here. Fact 10. The canyons. Florida isn't supposed to have. The Apalachicola Bluffs quietly break that rule. Along the river, erosion has cut deep, steep-walled ravines called steep heads, some plunging well over 100 feet, carved as groundwater seeps out and eats away the base of the slopes. The Nature Conservancy protects a stretch of them famously nicknamed the Garden of Eden. These formations are so unusual they occur in only a handful of places worldwide. Real canyons, in the state most associated with having no elevation at all. Fact 9. The mountains hiding in the plants. Those cool, shaded ravines hide a secret in what grows inside them. Because the steep heads stay cold and damp, plants and animals that belong hundreds of miles north in the Appalachian Mountains survive down here, marooned since the Ice Age. Mountain laurel, which you'd expect in the southern Appalachians, grows at the very bottom edge of its range in these Florida ravines. alongside salamanders whose closest relatives live in the mountains far to the north. It's a fragment of Appalachia hiding inside Florida, cut off from home for thousands of years. Fact 8. The bay that fed the whole state. Where the Apalachicola River finally meets the Gulf lies a bay that once punched far above its weight. Apalachicola Bay historically produced about 90% of all the oysters harvested in Florida, and roughly 10% of every wild oyster eaten in the entire United States. The mix of fresh river water and salt Gulf water created near-perfect conditions, and the dockside value of the catch ran into the millions every year. Around 2,500 people in tiny Franklin County depended on it. One small bay in the Panhandle was quietly feeding oyster lovers across the country. Fact 7. The collapse that ended a way of life. Here's the part nobody saw coming. In 2012, the Apalachicola Bay oyster fishery collapsed. The following year, in 2013, the federal government declared an official fishery disaster for the region. And by December 2020, the state shut the bay to wild oyster harvesting entirely, a closure set to last 5 years. Scientists point to a mix of causes: reduced fresh water flowing down the river, heavy harvesting after the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and long-term environmental stress. Researchers now say there are effectively no remaining natural oyster reefs left in the bay. An industry that lasted more than 150 years fell apart in a single decade. Fact 6. The water war behind the collapse. The reason that river ran low traces back to a fight most people have never heard of. For decades, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama have battled in court over the water in the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint River system, the same rivers that feed the bay. Upstream, the fast-growing city of Atlanta draws drinking water, and Georgia farms pull irrigation, which cuts the fresh water that once flowed down to Apalachicola. Less river water meant saltier bay water, and saltier water meant predators and disease moved in on the oysters. A collapse on the Florida coast was set in motion by a thirsty city hundreds of miles upstream. Fact 5. The river that built everything. Step back and one thread connects nearly all of it. The Apalachicola River is the force behind the white sand, the fertile bay, the rare trees, and the deep ravines, all of it. It carries more water than almost any other river in Florida, draining a basin that reaches up into Georgia and Alabama, and it feeds one of the most biologically rich regions in all of North America. Everything the Panhandle is famous for was delivered, shaped, or fed by this single river. The whole story of this coast is really the story of one waterway most tourists never even notice. Fact 4. The ancient shoreline frozen in the land. The strange terrain here is a record of a vanished sea. Around 2 million years ago, the shoreline of the Gulf sat far inland from where it is now, near the modern-day Apalachicola Bluffs. When the sea pulled back, it left behind old coastal sands that later eroded into those steep-head ravines, meaning the dramatic hills and valleys are the fossilized edge of an ancient ocean. On St. Vincent Island, the land itself is stacked in ridges, each one marking where the shoreline stood at a different point across 3,000 years. The Panhandle is a landscape built out of old coastlines, layered one on top of another. Fact 3. The bluffs that shouldn't exist in the flattest state. Consider what all of this adds up to. In a state whose highest point barely rises a few hundred feet, the Apalachicola region contains steep limestone bluffs, deep shaded canyons, air-filled caverns, and mountain plants, features that belong hundreds of miles to the north. Torreya State Park is said to have some of the most variable terrain of any park in Florida, with high plateaus dropping into river ravines. Standing on one of these bluffs looking down at the river, you would never believe you were in Florida at all. The flattest state in the east hid its most dramatic landscape in one quiet corner. Fact number 2. The Living Museum, nobody protects with fanfare. Piece it together, and the Panhandle is one of the most important ecological refuges on the continent. These bluffs and ravines shelter species found nowhere else on Earth. From the vanishing torreya to rare salamanders and endemic wildflowers, survivors from a colder world that vanished thousands of years ago. Scientists describe the Apalachicola region as one of the rarest habitats anywhere, home to an unusual concentration of plants and animals living at the far edge of where they can exist. It is a Noah's Ark of Ice Age survivors, and it sits mostly unnoticed behind the beach resorts. Fact 1. The secret, hiding under the sugar sand. And here's the biggest truth the Panhandle keeps. The thing tourists come for, that flawless white beach, is the smallest and youngest part of a story that stretches back tens of millions of years and hundreds of miles. Beneath and behind those beaches sits crushed Appalachian rock, the fossilized shoreline of a vanished sea, caves full of shark teeth, canyons that shouldn't exist, trees older than most of human history barely hanging on, and a bay that fed a nation until it died. The Florida Panhandle spends all its fame on 2 inches of sand, while everything that actually makes it extraordinary stays hidden just out of sight. And now you're one of the few people who knows it's there. So the next time somebody tells you the Florida Panhandle is just beaches and spring break, you'll know what's really underneath. The sand is a mountain range, the island holds Asian elk, the swamp was named by a dying man, and the quiet river behind it all built one of the rarest landscapes in North America and then watched a piece of it collapse. All of it hiding in plain sight. If this changed the way you see the place you live, stick around, because every corner of this country is hiding something and we're just getting started.